Hello Internet, Reconsider Simon here. In today's video I'm going to be discussing the film Flight of the Navigator, a massive childhood favourite of mine, and more specifically the fact that the actual narrative of the story was actually channeled from a dream. The original inspiration for this video concerning Flight of the Navigator came from a tweet that I read on Twitter. And it was written like this. It went, "This movie script was written by a guy who never wrote one. The whole idea came to him in a dream. Lot of occult symbolism in it." This was news to me. I mean, as I mentioned, Flight of the Navigator was a huge thing for me as a child. And the fact that this information had been channeled, I found really fascinating. Given what I now discuss on YouTube and what I've researched for many years now and my spiritual kind of activities, it makes sense why Flight of the Navigator was such a kind of huge film for me as a child. The overall concept of films are really powerful things. They're huge communicators. They seed a lot of concepts and ideas into humanity. And over the years, I've gathered a lot of like synchronicities and messages from films. So they've been really important on my journey. And, that can be used for good. The idea of like seeding concepts and expanding the consciousness of the collective can be a really good thing. But also it can be used for nefarious purposes because they are such a powerful tool. They can steer humanity in a particular way. They can manipulate. They can also propagandize as well. Going back to the original idea of this video in terms of like channeled ideas, like where do they come from? It could come from a dream when you're sleeping. It could be channeled within the daytime. You could have some kind of download. Where is this information coming from? Is it coming from your future self? Is it coming from a fragment of you in another dimension or time or space that you're not aware of? Is it coming from something outside of you, like a being, or an energy, or an angelic entity? This then begs the question, is that channeled information, is that a positive thing? Is it there to uplift humanity, to seed ideas, positive ideas, to expand awareness? Or is it there to manipulate and derail? You can research this yourself, but there are many examples in the sphere of ideas, creative ideas, or inventions coming from dreams. A big one would be DNA. Apparently that came from a dream. Also, more famously, the song Yesterday, written by Paul McCartney for the Beatles. He dreamt that song. And then when he woke up in the morning, he was convinced that someone had already written it and he'd heard it somewhere. It took him a few days to realise it was a completely unique song. Also, more weirdly, the sewing machine apparently came from a dream, and also the structure of an atom. On the whole thread of like channeled ideas and stories and narratives, a big one would be George Lucas. And there's an organisation called the Farsight Institute. And I've mentioned these guys before, and they're a team of remote viewers. And remote viewing is a type of militarized psychic mediumship where they can kind of view any point of time and space under blind conditions, so they don't know what the target is. But they had this project where they were remote viewing George Lucas, and where did he get these stories from? Where were these narratives from? And as it turns out, a lot of this information, a lot of the aesthetics of Star Wars came from past lives in another star system far, far away. He was basically seeding these stories into the collective consciousness through film. You can then look at like any sci-fi or stories, like, was this generally from someone's mind, or did this come from something else? Did it come from something larger than themselves? Are some of these sci-fis more historical than we realize? As I mentioned, when I was a young child when Flight of the Navigator came up, so I was born in the early 80s. And I can't remember if I watched Flight of the Navigator at the cinema or not, but definitely I had it on cassette VHS. And this was a time before obviously streaming and the internet. So you had a select few kind of collection of films. You could go to the video shop, or you'd have about 10 or 20 films at home. So the films that we did have at home, I just watch repetitively. So Flight of the Navigator, I just know the dialogue like inside and out. I can still watch it as an adult and just remember what's going to happen next and what people are going to say next as well. The whole story of Flight of the Navigator surrounds a character called David, who's 12 years old. And what happened, he's taken by a spacecraft after he falls into a ravine. And he's brought back, but it's 8 years later and he has no memory of what's happened to him. So he's still the same age, but everyone around him is older. So his parents are 8 years older, his brother's 8 years older. And eventually what happens, the authorities take him in, like NASA takes him in, trying to figure out what's actually happened to him. And what they discover is he's got loads of star charts, lots of information in his brain when they scan it. And coincidentally at the same time, there's this spaceship that crash lands quite close to where they are. And David and this spacecraft are held within the same facility. And we discover through the course of the film that David had this weird telepathic, symbiotic relationship with this craft. He can kind of hear this craft speaking to him. And eventually he's able to escape from his room and join the craft. And him and the craft then go on these crazy adventures. The actor who played David was called Joey Kramer, and he was a sort of child star at the time. He hadn't been in too many productions before Flight the Navigator, so he came relatively fresh to the project and is actually seen as being quite a naturally gifted actor as well. Flight the Navigator at the time had medium amount of success in the cinema, but it was mainly when it went to video that it really gained a lot of notoriety and a cult following. And Joey Kramer as a whole appeared in a few other productions afterwards. But the kind of the fame and the money as a child when he tried to go back to his normal life, especially going to school, kind of didn't go so well. He was targeted, like bullying, etc. And eventually, due to the trauma of that, he fell in with the wrong crowd. And as an older sort of teenager, he started to dabble in alcohol and drugs. And then that kind of lasted throughout most of his adult life. He got into a lot of trouble with drugs and alcohol. And eventually, as a kind of final cry for help, he decided to kind of commit a crime. So he committed armed robbery just to try and get out of that lifestyle, just to go in prison, get away from the drugs, get away from the alcohol, and try and get some kind of help. This whole story is documented in a film called Life After the Navigator, which I suggest you watch. Is really fascinating, and interviews this guy Joey Kramer quite extensively in his tribulations through life and his road to redemption. Thankfully he's kind of recovered from all his drug and alcohol abuse, and now he's sort of touring in America and even the world, going to sort of sci-fi conferences, and is also now reverted back into acting itself as well. The director of Flight the Navigator is Randall Kaiser, and he's famous for directing the original Grease film. Also, more controversially, he directed a film called Blue Lagoon. Of sort of relatively new information has come out with that to do with the child actors. So now that's slightly kind of controversial. But then also a film called Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, which is another one that I used to watch as a child as well. But quite synchronicity in terms of this video. He used to go to film school with George Lucas, and I think actually also lived with him as well for a period of time. As we spoke about before earlier, the whole narrative, the story for Flight of the Navigator came channeled from a dream. And the guy who did that was called Mark H. Baker. And as I mentioned, it came to him in a dream. And the original title, apparently, of the story was called Vanished. But the narrative to that sort of story was slightly different to the original film. It was a lot darker. The whole idea was David had plans for the spacecraft actually in his head. And then the authorities were able to gather the information from his brain and then start to construct this UFO. But then David started to realize that the authorities were never going to let him go. He was always going to be captive. So the original kind of narrative to the film did have a darker tone. And because Disney had a major kind of funding stake in the film, and they sort of slightly changed the narrative of it, and they made it a lot more kind of child-friendly to what it is today. In terms of occult symbolism, I mean, obviously as a child I was never aware of this sort of thing. It wasn't until an adult and I started to research these areas and have general knowledge to do with symbolism, how it works in films. In Disney, there's quite a lot of disturbing examples within a lot of, especially the kind of animated films as well. But I rewatched it recently, and I was very aware of some of the symbology that was quite obvious. Specifically, there's a shot in the film when the stairs are kind of made out of this kind of metallic liquid, and they kind of morph. So the opening of the ship opens up and it morphs into some steps, these kind of hovering steps. And they're quite sort of worrying symbolism within the steps, which I can leave you to research yourself. But they're definitely in that film. We've been speaking about the overall story and the narrative of the film being channeled. But you can also look at the general aesthetics, like, how it looks, some of the models within that film, whether some of those ideas have actually been channeled as well. And the actual film has a lot of mixture between sort of 3D models and also computer generated design. And for the time, it's actually quite groundbreaking. And Randall Kaiser had his brother, Jeff Kaiser, work on the film, and he was a computer whiz kid. And he'd already worked on films like Tron. But in terms of the design of the ship itself was done by another new person called Edward Myth. And he was recently out of university as well. And Randall Kaiser had literally just come across his design work by accident and actually gave him the commission to kind of design some of the craft within the show itself. And again, it's just like you're looking at these designs, you're like, how much of that information is actually from this guy Edward himself, or is it channeled from other experiences or other beings? I mean, these are kind of interesting questions to ponder. In the film, the actual spacecraft would morph. So when it was in a stationary position, it would be more like a teardrop shape, and then when it was going fast, the shape of the ship would change to more of a dart-like kind of shape. And some of the computer effects that use this kind of weird, like liquid metal morphing effect, they were actually eventually used by James Cameron, who created Terminator 2. There's kind of a bad Terminator in that film. It kind of morphs into different shapes, and apparently his inspiration for that came from Flight the Navigator. But the idea for designing spacecraft and UFO technology through kind of channeled information does have some precedent within kind of ufology, like mythology. And there's a lady called Maria Orsak, and she was part of a secret society called the Vril Society. And a lot of them were women. They had like long hair, and they perceived their hair as being antenna. And this was around about the time of the Nazis, during the beginnings of like World War II, kind of slightly before World War II. And they were doing a lot of channeling and automatic writing. And historically, they mentioned the fact that Maria Orsak, the kind of head of this group, was able to channel through automatic writing this Sumerian language, which when translated, actually kind of plans to design exotic propulsion and also a UFO craft itself. This group claimed they're actually channeling information from ETs in Aldebaran. And eventually, with this information that they channeled, they're able to design and build their own UFO craft. And initially, this was all for completely peaceful purposes, and the Nazi Party hadn't really got involved in this at all. Eventually, they took over and they started designing their own UFO craft, and then this kind of merges into UFO folklore, the whole idea that World War II is not what we really think it is, and the fact that, the Nazis actually gathered UFO technology and were able to kind of leave the Earth, which is quite fantastic if you think about it, and also move to areas like Antarctica, where they had this kind of base with all these UFOs there. So whether you believe that or not, but that information is kind of out there. As I touched upon before, the idea that within the film that David and the spacecraft have this symbiotic relationship, they have this sort of telepathy. There is precedent for that in kind of UFO mythology as well. There are experiences in whistleblowers who have claimed they've had interactions with captured UFO craft or had experiences on board. And they mention a lot about the fact that a lot of these craft are actually organic, they're grown, they have a consciousness. And also the pilots of these craft actually, again, have a symbiotic relationship because it's developed from their own DNA. So when they're flying around, they can see everything the craft is seeing. And if they get damaged, they know exactly what's going on with the UFO because of this kind of DNA, innate kind of organic connection they have with the craft itself. So as you can see, there's a lot to Flight the Navigator. So many connections with kind of modern ufology and some of the information that we've gathered from historical records or maybe experiences and other whistleblowers. But, the whole idea of film in general is quite important. And now film's really over 100 years old and is quite a powerful tool, again, for kind of expanding people's awareness and consciousness. And it's, you're put in a very vulnerable state because a lot of the time you're in a darkened room, you're just staring at the screen, and it's very kind of hypnotic effect with the music, and it's all kind of nicely lit, etc. So again, films are really, really powerful. But given that, there are some kind of negative effects to Flight the Navigator in terms of the symbology. overall, I think it's quite an important film because it is quite positive the way it seeds some of these ideas into the consciousness. And it is actually a positive film. A lot of the time, I found my gripes with sci-fi films is that it can be quite depressing, quite dystopian. And Flight the Navigator isn't like that. It actually has heart. It has kind of a lot of love in it. So from my point of view, I think it's quite a positive piece. Right, that's it. Thank you so much for watching or listening. I've been Reconsider Simon. You can catch me on YouTube, on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute. I've even started a podcast as well. Okay, thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.